I know this video probably won't get many views with me being a small YouTuber, but I'm making it because I want to. And for those of you who want to hear the rants of a person who loves these games to death, this is my present to you. This isn't just about comparing Elden Ring to Bloodborne, but about the Souls games in general and my personal journey through them. I've played every single Souls game, from Demon Souls up through Sekiro, and every single game's DLCs. The sole exception is the OG variant of Dark Souls 2, as I've only played Scholar of the First Sin, which I am told is probably for the best. The first one I ever played was Dark Souls 1, but back when it came out in 2011. I was 10 years old at the time, and got into the series thanks to my older brother. I never actually completed the game, however, until I was much older. Now I'm 21, and it feels crazy to me that I have literally played these games for over half my life. Dark Souls 1 was a little much for 10-year-old me, as up until that point my experience with gaming had boiled down to Wii Sports and Fire Emblem set to easy, which is a little depressing when I think about it. Why couldn't 10-year-old me just start out as a gaming pro? I know my kids will. Anywho, the first Souls game I actually managed to complete was Bloodborne. The year it came out, at the tender age of 14, I embarked on a journey that changed my life and the way I look at video games. To say that Bloodborne is a masterpiece is an understatement, but it's also not exactly a first for From Software. I mean, 2/3 of From's biggest titles from Miyazaki are called masterpieces. They stand as a herald of good game design in the age of modern AAA games. I felt like I was one of the few people who never once felt apprehensive about Elden Ring being an open world, and that's coming from somebody who isn't a particular fan of many open worlds. As soon as I heard it, I just shrugged and the hype never left, simply because the one thing I had learned about From Software is that you can trust them to make a fantastic gaming experience no matter what it is, open world or not. Dark Souls 1? Masterpiece. Bloodborne was a masterpiece. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is a masterpiece, and Elden Ring is undoubtedly a masterpiece. Demon Souls was more experimental and set the stage for the future. Dark Souls 2 had a plethora of issues, and it made me realize, like everyone else, that it's really Miyazaki that makes the masterpieces, but it's still a good game. Dark Souls 3 is a fantastic game that returns the series and brings the Dark Souls story to a very satisfying conclusion, but very clearly just isn't the best in the series. It's just a solid game. It is the hallmark, I would say, of an average quality Souls game, right in the middle, above Demon Souls and Dark Souls 2, but below the masterpieces. But of all the games that came out until Elden Ring, Bloodborne was the one I always looked at, and the word masterpiece truly rang and resonated throughout my whole body. I can still feel the blood-pounding battle with Ludwig in my mind, the dance of death with Gehrman on a field of flowers. After Bloodborne, I played all the Souls games, but none of them rang quite as true for me. This is of course biased from the point that Bloodborne was the first one that I played and finished. And indeed, at this point, I feel like I know the entire game inside and out. But then Elden Ring came out, and I finally got my hands on it, and after the first 20 hours, I began to wonder for the first time in 7 years, can this game possibly take over Bloodborne as my favorite game of all time? Elden Ring is truly a masterpiece. It's an open world that's huge in scale, but so dense with things to do it can almost be overwhelming. The visual aesthetics are incredible. I saw a post on Reddit once that showed off the fantastic color palette of the game, the sky showing deep reds, yellows, and greens just as often as the deep blues and purples that we come to expect from these games. The landscape was incredibly vertical, with huge cliffs blocking your line of sight. The game simply looks gorgeous. The individual areas are pretty decent too, with Stormvale in particular easily taking the cake as the best designed level in the entire game, striking a fantastic balance between visual spectacle and mechanical interconnectedness the series is known for. and really making the most out of the game's jumping mechanic. It was through Stormveil that I really started to have these thoughts of, oh damn, this might be better than Bloodborne. In terms of options, paths to go, builds to make, and all of those things, Elden Ring has an obvious advantage over Bloodborne. The magic system is the best it's ever been. The customizability of your build, especially with the Ash of War system, is incredible and on a level not seen before by any Souls game. I would definitely say Elden Ring is peak Dark Souls. And yet, for me, it's not peak Souls game. At the ends of the game, when I saw the credits go by, I thought to myself, damn, this game was incredible. It's a journey well and truly. But by then, the idea that this game might be better than Bloodborne was more in the back of my head as a light possibility than something I took seriously. And then, after another week or two of playing it, I became certain in myself that I believe Bloodborne is the better game. Now, don't get me wrong, Elden Ring is a masterpiece, and I will love this game and continue to play the crap out of it for months and possibly years to come. And just like how there are things Bloodborne and Dark Souls 1 have over Elden Ring, there are still things that Elden Ring does much better than those previous games just listed. In pure mechanics and moment-to-moment gameplay, Elden Ring surpasses any Dark Souls game. It's quite literally just Dark Souls 3, but more polished and with a couple mechanics added. Bloodborne and Sekiro are really the only games in the series that deviate enough from the formula that you could make comparisons to without being completely one-sided in Elden Ring's favor. Combat in Sekiro is rhythmic, a back and forth between you and your opponent, a dance of blades. It's secretly a rhythm game, and you can easily get lost in the combos between you and your opponent, in almost the same way that you can get lost in the melody of a good song that resonates with you deep in your core. Combat in Bloodborne is visceral and octane. Monsters scream and roar, knocking you from side to side of the arena. You dodge between flurries of attacks like a thread through a needle, and deliver your punishing riposte, covering you, your enemy, and the ground around you in gore. It's faster and more punishing than Elden Ring. There's just as much emphasis on tactics as Elden Ring, but it's more about how well you can see the attack of your enemy coming in advance and buffer the next input combo you need to achieve victory. Compared to Elden Ring's tactics, which is more about finding the correct solution, weapon, or tool to get you through any given situation. All three of these gameplay styles are incredible, and there really is no answer as to which one is the best. The combat systems of all three Souls styles are just as good as each other. However, there is something I will say about Elden Ring, and that is I wish the summoning ashes were not a thing, and in exchange some of the more aggressive bosses might be toned down just a smidgen. Now, I know what you all are thinking, that making some bosses easier is going the wrong way, since most people agree that for the most part, this is the easiest Souls game. But the problem is that the reason it's the easiest Souls game is because of how summons work, and how the bosses are designed with the summons kept in mind. Simply put, if summons didn't exist, this game would settle into two difficulty settings. This is insanity, or LOL, I just cheesed the boss with magic/bleed in 3 seconds. There are several bosses in this game that have such varied combos and insane aggression levels, especially later in the game, that it almost feels like the solution is to summon something and then pray you have enough DPS to kill the damn thing before your summon dies. And then when you do that, the boss goes from being the hardest wall you've yet to climb to something you can beat in 2 to 3 tries. This is something I experienced with Malenia, who I struggled against and formulated intense strategies and understanding of her whole moveset over the 6 hours of me beating my head against the wall that is her rotting but still incredibly sexy body. Then I summons the Mimic Tear for the first time against her and killed her in 4 tries. Now don't get me wrong, this fight was incredible, and after I killed her, I still had that elated feeling of I just did that, as I jumped up and down in my room at 2 a.m. but having me and my Mimic tier spam the Bloodhound's Fang weapon art against her after 6 hours of intense study of her moveset felt like cheese to me. Because using my previous weapon sets and strategies on her, I felt so close to getting it, and I almost feel like the victory would have been much sweeter if the summons weren't an option. Now, I already hear you saying, just don't use the summons, but to me, that goes against the very nature of Souls games. The whole point of not having an easy mode to players, the point made in response to journalists who complain about this, is that having the option to tone down the game will allow more people to achieve victory, but it takes away the feeling of victory that comes with it, because so many people, even the ones looking for a challenge like myself, will end up lowering the difficulty just a bit to deal with a wall and then turn it right back up. This is something I did exactly once in The Last of Us Part 2 against one of the bloater encounters, and it made the victory feel hollow and shitty. Malenia did not feel shitty. It felt great to finally overcome her. But it did feel just the teensiest bit hollow for me. The Souls games have always been about using everything you possibly can to your advantage, using all your tools to make the balance tip in your favor, and summons are no different. But to me, having the summons feels more like if the music box from Bloodborne was usable more than twice in the fight, and could also be used against every boss in the game. I really would love to see how some of the bosses might feel like to fight if they were designed to be dueled instead of ganked. What if Malekith had a slightly easier moveset to fight against, but in exchange focused all of his attention on the player instead of 20% with me and 80% to the Great Shield soldiers chipping his ankles? This is something I personally think Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Dark Souls all did better than Elden Ring, making the bosses designed to fight the player specifically. And even though Elden Ring has the most evolved combat in all of the Souls games, and the combat on par with Bloodborne and Sekiro, to me it's the bosses in particular that make the victories just the slightest bit not as satisfying as Bloodborne and company. In the future DLCs for Elden Ring, I hope to see more uses for summons outside of bosses, and more bosses where summons aren't allowed, and are therefore designed around that concept. While we are still on the concept of bosses and game mechanics, and not yet on lore, level design, and atmosphere, I want to talk about the Godskin Apostle, and to a lesser extent, the Godskin Noble. My first encounter with the Apostle was in Caelid, at the bottom of the Divine Tower, before I had even successfully killed Radahn. It was my first encounter with the boss, and it was fucking awesome. The fight was incredible, always back and forth. The combos and melee of the boss were cool and unique and memorable. That moment when Phase 2 started and he suddenly became a fucking slinky for the first time is always something I will remember. After finally besting the Apostle in Caelid at like level 45, he became my absolute favorite boss fight for a very long time deep into the game. It helped that I never actually found the one in Altus Plateau, so the boss remains a unique one-time encounter in my mind. Godskin Noble was pretty similar, my first encounter with him being on the bridge to the Divine Tower of Liurnia. It made me start to associate the Godskin bosses with the Divine Towers. And again, in Volcano Manor, when I encountered him, I thought to myself, oh cool, I get to fight this dude again. And while I don't remember that fight as fondly as the first time with either Apostle or Noble, it was still an okay fight. But then came Godskin Duo, and frankly, since that fight, I never wanted to fight either of them ever again. Both the Godskin Noble and the Godskin Apostle by themselves were fantastic bosses. And that fight single-handedly made me hate both of them. I don't even really feel the need to go in-depth on it, as I think most people here already know what I'm talking about, and the whole experience really bogged down the game for me. I'm fine with reused bosses, especially when the game is this big, but there's a difference between fighting your 10th Erdtree Avatar and fighting Godskin Duo. Avatar is always fun. They sometimes have little iterations and differences that keep them fresh, too. Godskin Duo is more like if Smo was as fast as Ornstein, and Ornstein was just as hard-hitting as Smo, and you had to kill them 3.5 times due to them respawning instead of the dynamic fight we actually got. That boss single-handedly ended my items-only challenge run. But ultimately, this is just a rant and ramble about a specific encounter in a 100-hour game I didn't like, so it's not like it matters that much. Just felt like it was worth mentioning. I feel like it wouldn't be as bad if this was in, like, Lindell Capital, for example. But the fact that it's at the very end of the game mars my final opinion of the game, which is obviously going to be finalized, like, only 10 hours after that fight in my first playthrough. I don't remember ever having a moment like that in Bloodborne where a single boss impacted even slightly my opinion of the game as a whole. Even Mikolash was awesome on the first playthrough. Specifically, the first playthrough. Now he's a speed bump. Okay, next I want to talk about the level design. I'll have more direct comparisons to Bloodborne and Souls than just ranting about Godskin Duo, and I'll talk about sound design in the chapter after that, and then the final bosses of the games. Okay, so the thing From Software is really known for in level design is the shortcut system, where you have one point you keep looping back to and unlock further shortcuts in the area for. They're also famous for having levels to connect to each other and twist back around to each other. There are these moments in the games where you have an aha moment when you take an elevator from Undead Bird and end up back in Firelink Shrine, or when you climb from the Forbidden Woods and end up in Central Yharnam. These are incredible moments where you stop and think to yourself, damn, how did they do that? And it really rocks like no other moment does. Obviously, due to both Elden Ring being an open world, and by extension needing a map, these moments of interconnectedness are not present in this game, but that's not something I can fault the game for. It's an open world after all. There's no way you can climb up a ladder in Redmane Castle and suddenly find yourself at the first step. And if there were, the moment and reveal would be ruined by the fact that you surely would have seen it coming by looking at your map and realize where you're headed. There's obviously give and take when it comes to this kind of gameplay choice, and these moments are taken in exchange for grand vistas overlooking seemingly miles of land before you, knowing that every pocket is something you can explore with something to do. But where I can criticize Elden Ring is the designs of some of the main areas themselves. Stormvale is an incredible area. It's huge and complex and maze-like, and has tons of interconnected shortcuts leading back to spots you've been at. Secrets in every nook and cranny of the level. And after you truly understand it, you can go through Stormvale in a matter of minutes while engaging less than 10 total enemies. It's truly a marvel, and stands among From Software's best designed areas, right alongside Undead Burg, Central Yharnam, and Cathedral of the Deep. It's easily the best area in Elden Ring, and is only matched in complexity and shortcuts by the subterranean Shunning Grounds, an area deeply underappreciated in Elden Ring simply because it's ugly. The Shunning Grounds are fantastic. Seriously, go explore them more. The other memorable one that comes to mind is Lindell, but Lindell is mostly fondly remembered for its spectacle rather than its design. The design is great, having a whole city and rooftops to explore was fantastic, but instead of having a main road that takes me where I want to go with little alleys and small items, I would have preferred the first half of Lindell up to the west rampart, where instead me going through the various houses and buildings, opening up all the doors between the houses until I eventually get a straight, visible line of open doors through like 10 buildings that then lead to the main road and sewers. And then I would have added a way to explore the rooftops by using a ladder. But that's just me, and I am not a game designer, so take that with a grain of salt. But other than those three, no other areas really stood out to me. The dungeons were cool puzzles, but I wasn't exactly leaping in joy whenever I entered one. I'd say the biggest disappointments were Farum Azula and the Howling Tree. Azula is very cool and incredibly striking in the visuals, but when you think about it, there's actually zero of the interconnectedness that we associate with From Software's levels. The level is entertaining enough to run through, lots of neat platforming, but none of the enemies are particularly memorable or challenging, and there are zero shortcuts. The whole thing is a straight shot gauntlet from point A to point B. And there's like 8 frickin' sites of grace in the area. why so many? It's clearly too much. I wasn't even remotely challenged in the ends of the game, except for the bosses themselves. Haligtree is much the same, but a little better, and with more secrets and knickknacks. Compare this to Bloodborne. We didn't just have Central Yharnam to drool over for level design. Right after it, we had Cathedral Ward, then Hemwick Charnel Lane, and then Old Yharnam, Forbidden Woods, Yahar'gul, the Nightmare Realms, Canehurst. All of these areas were so in-depth. I'm purposely not mentioning the DLC areas because that wouldn't be fair to Elden Ring, as its DLCs are not out yet, and they'll probably have incredible level design, knowing From Software's quality and talent and staff. My point is, in Bloodborne, every single area was a total banger, even if they weren't connected to each other. That's not to say the level design in Elden Ring was boring. They were well made, and if nothing else, an extremely pleasant gauntlet of obstacles. But they didn't quite have the design I was looking for and hoping for as someone who deeply loves the Souls games' designs. Bloodborne had the best level design this genre has ever seen, and not a single game has topped it. Closest to it was Dark Souls 1, which had more interconnectedness, but each area not quite standing up to Bloodborne's on their own, especially towards the late game, when we have things like the Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith. Now let's talk about sound design. Elden Ring breaks from the usual formula in Souls by adding background music to all areas in the game instead of select areas and bosses. It's the second game to do this after Sekiro, and I personally don't mind this. I think it's just as valid as having no music like the other games did, but achieves a different purpose. In Elden Ring, everything is done to serve the idea that this world is grand and big. The music plays a part in that too, and serves its purpose fantastically. Although I do find it annoying when I walk within 10 feet of an invader, and we are emote spamming each other, and the overly intense battle music kicks in. Bloodborne, much like the other Souls games, has no music except in particularly special areas and boss fights, and achieves just as much atmosphere through the rest of the sounds in the game. The silence makes you listen to every detail in Bloodborne, every footstep, every gust of wind, the breathing and footsteps of you and every beast around you, the clanking and sputtering of your weapons as you switch from mode to mode, the soft cries of babies in the background. It all leads to a sense of unease and tension your whole playthrough, where you don't know what lies around the corner. It also makes the music that does play more memorable. I've played through Elden Ring 5 times now, and the only soundtrack I can remember clearly is the main menu theme, and by extension, the final boss of the game. Ask any person who's played Dark Souls 1 even once what songs they specifically remember clearly, and they will say at a bare minimum Firelink Shrine, Gwen, the Lord of Cinder, and Nameless Song. And also probably Ornstein and Smo, and maybe a couple others. If you asked me what Melania's theme sounded like, I wouldn't be able to tell you, and it took me 6 straight hours of fighting her to beat her. I haven't gone through a playthrough of Bloodborne in 3 years, and I still hum Gurman's theme when I take a shower to this day. It's part of what makes the fight so special. Ask any person who just finished their first playthrough of Bloodborne what music they vividly remember besides the main menu. And they'll mention all the iterations of the Hunter's Dream. They'll mention Murga's Wet Nurse, and Gurman, the Cleric Beast, and probably Gascoigne. Obviously, these are not including the DLCs, because once again, that wouldn't be fair to Elden Ring, as its DLCs are not out yet. This is not to say that one is better than the other. Although I personally prefer Bloodborne, I think both have strong level designs, and I think the background music in Elden Ring, more than the other games, is made to be in the background and not an integral part of the boss's lore worth analyzing like Dark Souls and Bloodborne had. And that's completely okay. Just because the music in the 2 games have different purposes does not make one better than the other. But I definitely have my preference. And the music in Elden Ring is good, but the music in Bloodborne I find is more memorable in particular to the bosses that I fight. For this last bit of the video, we'll talk about final bosses. Simply put, the final boss of Elden Ring is the worst final boss in any Souls game, even Dark Souls 2. Radagon is a fantastic fight. We're familiar with his lore, it's cool to see him in his fighting style, it's fun as hell. The Elden Beast is a random blob monster with a sword we've heard absolutely nothing about in the lore up until then, who runs away and spams big AoEs. A second phase and health bar of Radagon would have been much better as a final boss. Even better than that would have been Hoaraloo as the final boss and relegating Radagon to a final cutscene. Since at least Hoaraloo, we have a lot more integral lore and a warm-up fight the last time we were in Lindell. And even better, he's a name we were familiar with right up in the opening cutscene. In fact, in my first playthrough, I thought he was the final boss and was fucking hyped. And then got disappointed when I realized there was more and saw what it was. Radagon could have been an excellent boss fight that they could have even kept, but perhaps have him be a hidden final boss that you need to meet certain conditions to fight, similar to the Moon Presence from Bloodborne, or maybe put him elsewhere. Compare Radagon and the Elden Beast to Gwen the Lord of Cinder. Mentioned in the opening cutscene, we know he's important, just like Godfrey and Hoaraloo, but throughout the entire game we see his family, learn what drives him, and that it was ultimately his mistakes and failures that led the world to the sad state it is in now. He's a genuine character in the game. Radagon is undeniably important, but not as important as Godfrey, at least in terms of the lore and how it relates to us directly. And again, what the fuck even is the Elden Beast? We've never heard of him. Compare Radagon and the Elden Beast to the Soul of Cinder from Dark Souls 3. One of the more direct comparisons, as it's also another final boss we've heard nothing of before meeting. Only in the Soul of Cinder's case, it plays a part in building up the world and keeping consistent, with the flames summoning past Lords of Cinder as its defender, meaning essentially you're fighting your character from Dark Souls 1. And when that Gwen theme and moveset kicked in and we realized what the Soul of Cinder is doing as a last-ditch effort to stop you, it made every Souls player cream themselves. Soul of Cinder was a love letter to Dark Souls, and absolutely makes it a fantastic final boss and send-off to the series. Compare Radagon and the Elden Beast to Old King Allant from Demon Souls. The moment you realize that the one you fought at the top of the tower was a demon, and the real king has turned into this sad blob due to his own greed for power, is a real moment in the game. And the fight is easy and over in 3 seconds, completely by design. An excellent final boss in a completely different way than Elden Ring. Now, Elden Ring probably would not have been able to pull this off as its final boss due to its grand atmosphere and its mainstreamness, but it still works better than what looks like a yellow version of the corrupted celestial spirit king from Fairy Tail with a sword. Lastly, compare Radagon and the Elden Beast to Gehrman, the Moon Presence, or Murgo's Wet Nurse, the 3 possible final bosses of Bloodborne. The Wet Nurse is the most similar to Elden Beast, again being a large-bladed monster that we need to kill that we haven't heard of before. But we have heard of Murgo before, and we see that Murgo is defenseless and formless. And while we don't have the main menu music playing in the background, we have this eerie music box playing in the background as the Wet Nurse attacks us. Quiet whooshes of her blades. This fight is fucking incredible, and while I think it's probably the weakest of the 3 last bosses to have specifically as a final boss, it still leagues better than the Elden Beast, which, again, is a giant blob that prances around the arena like it's playing hopscotch. And also, slaying the Wet Nurse, and by extension Murgo, is the thing we were directed to do at the beginning of the game in order to escape the hunter's dream. As for the moon presence, he is a great one, unique among great ones. Not particularly difficult as a fight, he adds a lot of story, and hearing the Hunter's Dream song as a boss music was way more impactful as the main menu theme for Elden Beast, because ultimately, the main menu has nothing to do with the actual story of the game. By contrast, hearing the song I've heard in the Hunter's Dream and associated with safety and mystery twisted into a song of a malformed creature bent on turning me into a vegetable to serve it and continue the cycle gave me chills. It was also something we suspected existed. As the player goes through the game of Bloodborne, they're giving constant hints that there is a great one behind the scenes, hosting the Hunter's Dream and being the cause of our mission. And when the curtain is finally pulled back in the last moments of the game, either as a boss or a post-Garmin cutscene, it's horrifying and fits the eldritch horror of Bloodborne to a T. And then there's the big daddy of all final bosses, Gehrman, the first Hunter. This boss is the best final boss to any video game, as both a fight, story-wise, and thematically. We connect with Gehrman more than any other boss listed here, as throughout the journey and the entirety of Bloodborne, he has been the kind, old, sad, but kind of off-putting ex-hunter in a wheelchair, guiding us along our path and providing insight to the journey. His story and curious mania with the doll is especially interesting. He's integral to the story of the game, and a deeply tragic figure who, even at the end when he's trying to kill you, wanted what was best and merciful for you, at the cost of his own sanity and extending his imprisonment in the dream. No other boss in the series has come close to the quality of Gehrman as a final game-ending boss. Overall, the end of Elden Ring was a letdown to me, but other than the very end of the game and a couple hiccups along the way, Elden Ring is still a masterpiece I enjoyed from start to finish, and will be playing for months and possibly years, just like Bloodborne, which I will likely revisit occasionally for the rest of my life. But if you were to ask me which is better between the two, you would get your answer well before you put the gun to my head. Thank you for listening to this long ramble, if any of you actually made it this far. I mostly made this for myself, but if even one person here read this far and was entertained by me, that makes me happy. Please drop a comment below. I'd love to chat about people and their opinions on the matter. Even better, I would love people who played Elden Ring, but not the other Souls games, to be maybe encouraged by this to try them out. Especially Bloodborne, which is, in my own personal opinion, one of the best games ever made. With that, I bid you adieu. Thank you guys very much for watching. Please subscribe and have a great day.